Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Astrid Haas. Astrid is an urban economist and independent consultant working with urban governments and NGOs on issues of municipal finance and strategic infrastructure planning. Astrid previously worked as head of the Cities That Work initiative and as policy director at the International Growth Center and as an economist at the African Development Bank.
Thank you very much. I have the difficult position of having to speak after a Nobel Prize winner, so I'm just going to caveat that. But, you know, I had the privilege last year of sitting on a bus ride in Davos next to Paul, and I think it was one of my most illuminating conversations because we came to find that we have a lot more in agreement than we do in disagreement. And I say this because those of you who have seen me speak on this topic before know I'm probably one of the loudest dissenting voices that there is. And the reason Patrick in his opening remarks mentioned there's not a lot of concrete evidence, but I would argue there's not a lot of concrete evidence for the reason that we can't make it work. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak to you from my experience. Let me tell you, I feel strongly enough about this that I made the 18-hour flight journey from Kampala, Uganda, where I'm from and where I live, for 48 hours in New York. And because I feel very strongly that this is a narrative that is playing out, that is detracting us from the true challenges or trying to face the true challenges and unlock the true opportunities in urbanization. So I say this from my research, I say this from my work, but most importantly, I say this as a citizen in my own country, Uganda, my own city, Kampala, which is one of the fastest urbanizing cities in the world. So my presentation today, and I do have slides, is that I want to start by highlighting where we do agree. Because, as I said, I do think there are parts that we agree on, and I think it's important that we draw those out. But then I want to also highlight, and this is really important to me, that I do not believe that the new city, charter city, smart city, whatever format you want to put it in, model, is going to get us there. And I'll explain why. And even if it were to succeed, and this is kind of the title of my presentation, is that it would create cities for a privileged few, rather than absorb the 1 billion people that are yet to move to cities in the next 20 to 30 years. So I will try to put forward the case for that as well. But there are things that we can do, and I'll start outlining those, but I know there's others who are going to speak on it later, so I won't go into too much detail. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Whether I manage or not, I don't know, but at least I appreciate the Charter Cities Institute for inviting me, even though, as Curtis knows very well, we have very strongly opposing views on this issue. I think it's healthy to always have a debate on these topics and see where we come to. So here's what I do think we agree on. We agree that we need to get urbanization right, particularly in my part of the world. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent to date. Our urban transition is even faster, some would say, than China's. And we want that urbanization to unlock productivity benefits. We want that urbanization to be livable for the majority of people who live in. And we want, importantly, also for that urbanization to be sustainable. I think we can all agree on that. And the reason we think this can happen is because we have enough evidence across history, across the globe, that well-managed urbanization can lead to positive outcomes. So there's no country in the world that has reached middle income status today that hasn't gone through a well-managed urbanization process. But the emphasis here is on well-managed. And I think this is critical. This is why, and this is taken from a graph from The Economist, because I think it illustrates very well, why you see in Asia the sort of urbanization, and economic growth correlation being very strong. But in the African context, you can see very high urbanization, but leading to, in some cases even, backwards outcomes in terms of GDP growth. And then you see the downsides of density, including slums, congestion, crime, etc. So the emphasis is really on the well-managed. What does it take to be well-managed? I think it's about the urban authorizing environment, which I use as a catch-all term for institutions, policies, legal framework. I think here we also agree that it's something about, as Paul said, the governance of the space. Now, Curtis asked me to touch on this. This is a paper that I wrote a couple years ago with my co-author, Shah. And we talked about, like, how can we think about urban authorizing environments for cities? And we thought about it in sort of 3 buckets: across space, across time, and across functions. What do I mean by this? I'm going to just sort of briefly touch on this because it's not the core of my presentation or not the core of my argument, but I do think it's important that we can say that there are some fundamental principles, yeah? Please note, I'm saying principles and not blueprints, that I think need to be in place, particularly when it comes to cities. I'm going to use the example from Kenya, because it's a case study we did on Nairobi, and transportation to try and illustrate what I mean by the authorizing environment. So Kenya has had a number of reforms, not just the constitutional reforms that have devolved a lot more power to counties, but it's also gone through a reform process to try and empower its authorities and its ministries to be able to work in a more productive and efficient way. So the first sort of coordination, or the sort of the across space, we can think of in 2 ways. One, across space vertically, so that now it's very clear that ministries set policies and strategies, the national government sets the vision, and those trickle down through the planning hierarchy. But that actually it's a mix between the planning hierarchy, between the sort of national strategy and the local knowledge that come together as one. And it's also being able to look at space in terms of geographic space, because cities, in many cases, outgrow their administrative boundaries. So how do you plan for the true city and not just where the borders, in the sense, have been put? And this was done in Kenya or in Nairobi through the Nairobi Master Plan and the Nairobi Metropolitan Transport Authority. Then you need to be able to plan across time. You need to be able to plan longer than political cycles, because cities, I mean, centuries maybe, they take time to grow, but importantly, when we think about transport, and this is roads, this is actually national data, but the point more so is that once you can start planning across time, you can start allocating things like funds for operation and maintenance for a longer term period and time horizon, which means that your investments are actually going to remain productive. So again, you need to be able to plan across space, you need to be able to plan across time, and then you need to be able to plan across functions. So functions being who does what, and everyone knows who does what in terms of agencies, and do they have the mandate to do so? I think these are fairly simple notions, but not something that we have come to grasp with. It's only one part of the governance structure, and I'm just highlighting this because it's one of the parts that I've written on before. But I think there are general principles of governance that need to work in cities for cities to function. However, now I'm going to come to my dissenting view. This is not going to be resolved by a charter city or a new city model. And I'm going to outline some of the reasons that I think make the case of why I don't think we're going to see a charter city come, and we're not actually going to be able to get that evidence that Patrick was saying. But I also think the lack of evidence in this case is actually the evidence that speaks louder than words. So, first of all, private capital is expensive. Yeah? I think we have examples, many, many new examples. I mean, this is a new fad right now. Every wannabe dictator, an actual dictator, I speak from experience, wants to build their new city, right? Why do they want to do this? Oh, it's a wonderful legacy project, yeah? Why do they want to do this? Oh, you can ignore the challenges and the mess of the rest of the cities, and we can just leave that aside and just build a new city. And why do you want to do this? Well, it looks great and flashy. We could be the next Dubai, we could be the next Singapore, and we could be the next Hong Kong. So what you get is places like Eco-Atlantic in Nigeria. Nigeria is actually at the forefront of new city construction. I think the last time I checked, they had like 25 on the go right now, right? What is Eco-Atlantic? Well, Eco-Atlantic is an enclave for the very, 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 very rich. Currently, a 2-bedroom apartment that is not even fully constructed yet is already going for over $1.5 million, right? We're not even talking here about middle class. Hi, Ed. We're not even talking here about middle class. We're talking about the super rich. And the reason is, if you're going to invest in a place like Lagos, you're going to have to contend with finding the money to do so, right? You're working with a banking system that is not, or financial markets that are not functional. In my own country, actually, I don't know what it is in Nigeria, but currently, if you want to take a mortgage in my own country, you pay 26% in interest. Guess how many people are taking mortgages? Not very many. So if you're going to make that investment, you've got to have to reap the returns of that investment too. And so there's no way you can do that unless you start being able to charge the $1.5 million for an incomplete 2-bedroom house. Similarly, you're not working in a vacuum. You're working in a space where land markets are dysfunctional. And this is the case not just in Nigeria, it's across most African cities. So once you say, hey, we're going to build our Eco-Atlantic, guess what happens? Speculation. In the absence of a land register, loads of court cases, and land values shoot up. Again, if you're going to invest in those places, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to make that return overall. And if you're going to do this, right, well, who are you going to cater for? Not the majority of the population who live essentially right next door to this in Makako and Lagos, right, who still have to survive in the city. And this is not even to mention, right, that not everything in a city can be packaged into a bankable project. There are public services, there are other parts that make cities functional and livable and sustainable, but may not be bankable. So that's my first argument. We are working in a space, right? We're not working with blank slates, we're working in structures that are just going to make these cities expensive, and therefore, by necessity, if they even get built, cater for the rich. Secondly, historically, where cities have been successful, infrastructure has followed the market where people are or where people are going to move, rather than on a greenfield site and then try to get the people to move there. And if, in the context of my own continent, Africa, now I'm generalizing a lot, and I will caveat Africa is obviously a very diverse place of 54 countries, many, many, many more cities, so I don't feel comfortable generalizing, but for the sake of the argument, please forgive me. But I will say I have worked in a lot of places across the continent, and there are some generalizations that can be made. And one of them, which is not unknown, is that the infrastructure deficit overall is high. This is the map on the right shows, I think, the amount of destinations you can reach from Singapore's Tangai Airport in one flight, right? Let me tell you, my 18 hours to get here was not only as a result of the fact that I live very far away, but the result of the fact that I don't have very many options, right? I live in a landlocked country. All my fuel comes via the port in Mombasa, across roads that have very deep potholes, right? And so during COVID, when the borders were closed, our fuel prices shot up, our food prices shot up because nothing could enter the country. And I've just given some statistics here just to highlight it, but the point is, you can't invest in a greenfield site and make a city successful if that city has, or if those firms will have no markets or no infrastructure to get to markets, because no one's going to want to locate there. You can give them as many tax breaks as they want, but if they can't get anywhere, or if they're going to pay, a shipping container to be able to export their goods, it's not going to be that attractive to locate there. And this is partly the reason why these special economic zones, or the notion of special economic zones, hasn't worked, because governments think it's about the tax breaks, but in fact it has nothing to do with the tax breaks. It has to do with the fact that it's just not very pleasant to invest there. Okay? So that's my second argument. Whatever city you build, if it's not going to be able to, if you can't invest in the larger infrastructure challenge around it, then you're not going to attract the firms or the productivity that you want, just simply because it's just not that attractive. And that's much bigger than any charter city, any mayor can do. This is like a national macroeconomic, even regional challenge, even continental challenge. And then this is actually just from January. As I said, these new cities are popping up everywhere. And this is why I feel very strongly about it, because it's detracting the real necessary conversation that we need to have, that we're the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. When we talk about cities now on the continent, we're talking about these places. Oh, the new smart city, or the new... In my own country, in Uganda, one of the most challenging land tenure systems in the world, where we have, I think, currently a delay of 6 to 7 years in the courts if you want to have a land challenge. My president gave away land to a pop star who said, hey, I'm going to build you the most digital, smartest, newest city, a pop star called Akon. And guess what? There are going to be Akon coins that will create a whole new currency, right? And that's the problem. The problem is what's being sold under this term seems very attractive because it feels like you can just ignore everything else and just make it happen. And guess what? Wannabe dictators and dictators, the thing they love is silver bullets, right? Sell them a silver bullet, it's great. This here is this Mnangagwa, President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe's new pet project, just outside of Harare. It's called Mount Hamdan. Built to resemble Dubai. As I said, Dubai is the pinnacle right now. But it changes, some days it's Hong Kong, some days it's Singapore, but right now Dubai is in fashion. And he's getting money for it. In this particular case, he's getting Chinese loans for it. Guess what? Those Chinese loans will have to be paid back. So this is we're not even talking about private sector money. This is money that the government is taking on. And as someone said, they're mortgaging Zimbabwe for this project. And as with every good new city, they're creating extensive tax breaks. So not only are they taking out loans, they're actually stopping the ability to actually regain the money to repay those loans. And this is not an extreme example. Unfortunately, this is becoming the norm rather than the exception. And in this case, the one thing that is maybe a little bit different is that it's already been tagged as a city for the rich. At least in some places, people try and still create the illusion that they're going to have some affordable housing. In this case, they've just detracted from the illusion. The other thing is, the other argument I make with trying to do new cities, cities from scratch, smart cities, you take whatever term you want, insert there. Cities are much more than just infrastructure. Cities, successful cities, like the city we're in now, it's about the culture, it's about the society, it's about moving there because you have your family networks, it's about this, there's an underlying thing that makes cities successful that irrespective of what infrastructure you're going to put there, is difficult to recreate. And in fact, I don't think we've ever, as humans, been able to recreate that. That's why we have we have more failed new city examples around the world. Think the Brazilians. This one is an example from Malaysia, Cyberjaya. I've actually been to Cyberjaya. Cyberjaya is like, smart city 3.0. It even has a metro line to Kuala Lumpur, so they even thought about the connectivity thing. But to this day, these smart homes with big screens and everything else, they're empty. Because they couldn't recreate what it would be for people to actually want to move there. So I don't think we have the ability to say, okay, this is what a city is, beyond maybe the governance and the infrastructure. And then I think the most important thing for me is we're not working in a policy vacuum. And Paul, even to your Hong Kong example, whilst I agree with a vibrant, thriving city, the history of Hong Kong, it was also a colony that was colonized that at some point had guns and people defending that, right? And coming from a country with the history of a very young history and still, for some people, in living memory, what that means, I think that is not something to be ignored. And as I said, institutions and policies, even at a local level, cannot be divorced from everything else that's happening. And I think particularly when we're working in very fragile institutional contexts, even if you were to come in and say, hey, we're going to have this city with this governance structure, and the president goes, yes, 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 have your city with the governance structure. Guess what? Rule of law can change from one day to the next. I know this for a fact. My president can wake up one day and we can have a whole new law. And that's the law, because that's the institutional settings we're working in. Contract enforcement, judicial systems, institutional enforcement. You can set out what you want to do. You can get agreements. You can get everything signed on pieces of paper. But if someone gets up the next day, and that's why I think even if you were to get to the point where you have a president or whoever buying into this concept, particularly as a lot of them are associated with legacy projects, but even take that aside, I don't think it would survive a political change, because it won't be the legacy project for the next person. And it may not even survive that person's leadership, because they could just wake up one day and feel like, actually, now, that's not the case. And I've seen a lot of things go through that, not only cities, right? Fads. And, I think so I love Dave Kaputa's work. I think he's in Toronto. He's written a lot about this. I agree with a lot of what he says. I think I just want to say that project we saw in Zimbabwe, it actually has its own budget for the statues, the pictures, and the quotes of the president that were going to be put around the city. These are the political economies that govern many of these places. Okay, now I've had my pessimistic rant about why I think this doesn't work. I still work as an urban economist because I truly believe, for my own country, for the African continent, urbanization has one of the strongest potentials to unlock growth and development. And I just want to touch now a little bit on where I do think the opportunity is. But as I said, others will be talking about this more. I think we need to acknowledge that not only is Africa's urbanization trajectory unique in terms of its speed, we're also urbanizing at a time where we're resource constrained, partly due to our own fault, because we're not urbanizing and industrializing at the same time. But generally, the world after the 2008 financial crisis, now the COVID and the associated economic crisis, there's not as much money to go around. But importantly, we're also urbanizing in a climate-constrained environment. We cannot build lots of smokestack industries, right? That's a thing of the past. We got to figure out a different way forward. But the opportunity is, we've also never had this much data before, right? No other place that has urbanized has ever had this much data to be able to predict where people are moving to. We're not even taking a risk anymore. We can figure this out. We have the pioneer in this room with the Atlas of Urban Expansion, and I want to call that out because I do think this is literally the urban expansion project, which I think, Patrick, you'll be talking about a little bit later, maybe not, but which actually just looks at where people are moving to and helps governments in their own capacities be able to plan for those areas, is really one of the most powerful and impactful things I have seen happening. And last week, just before I came here, I was on a 9-hour car journey to the very northernmost tip of Uganda on the border of South Sudan, where we have one of our new cities. New cities being, it's just been declared a city, not new city in the sense that it's Arua. Arua was one of the places that has benefited from the urban expansion project. And all the things I've seen there, that's what they've internalized. They know how it works and they're doing it. And that's because you can tell where people are moving, so plan for that. And we have enough cities in Africa where we know people are moving. We even have villages that we know we're going to be cities in the next 10 years, right? We don't need to try and take a risk and figure out some sort of greenfield site about where this is going to work. We know where people want to move. We don't have to recreate those social structures, those underlying dynamics. No, because people know that. That's why they move to places. So this is just from the map of the Atlas of Urban Expansion. This is one of the secondary cities in Kenya, but it just goes to show this data is just on the internet. It's there, it's available. You don't even have to, thanks to Solly and his team, you don't even have to do the analysis yourself. It's there. And I just wanted to show this photograph, which is a little bit light, but this is a photograph I took from the plane when I was flying. I work in Somaliland. One of the reasons, by the way, I spent 2 hours yesterday in US detention on immigrating here because of I do work in Somalia. But I work in Somaliland. Somaliland is not a recognized country, and therefore it doesn't receive a lot of aid flows. It has a very small city budget. But even in Somaliland, this is the outskirts of Hargeisa, they're planning for their expansion. And all they're doing is just bulldozing space and showing people this is where you need to settle. And when we have some money, we'll put some infrastructure there. So it doesn't even need to be an expensive undertaking. It doesn't require this public capital. It doesn't require this. It just requires know where people are moving and make space for it and make sure they settle in a way that when you have the money, you can make the infrastructure investments. Because actually one of the most expensive things that a city like my own, like Kampala, faces is the retrofitting, right? Because you got to move people. So it's not only financially, it's socially, and it's politically costly. And then just one final word on the policy and the governance piece. Because I know Shenzhen is always, and someone else is speaking on Shenzhen, and I'm not an expert on Shenzhen, but I do want to use Shenzhen, and I want to preemptively use Shenzhen because I know it's always used as one of the examples. I don't think the learning from Shenzhen is take a blueprint and do it. I think, having worked on a project together with the government of China and in Kenya and Ethiopia, I think actually one of the learnings is experiment, figure out what locally works, and don't actually use the blueprint, right? This Chinese saying, cross the river by feeling the stones, is what I really think we should do. And I think that's what I take from the Shenzhen example, right? That was a very successful example of experimentation with local policies that allowed them to figure out what could make Shenzhen work. But again, I won't focus too much on that because I'm not the expert in it. I know someone else is going to be speaking about that. But I wanted to preemptively use that because it's often used to make the point, oh, you can import. They didn't import. They experimented. And I think that's what we should be doing more of. So just to conclude, as you can probably tell, I feel very strongly about this topic because I live and work in a space where it's being preached as a solution or as the way to unlock urbanization. My strong feeling is that this is not only misguided, but it's irresponsible. Because no city that is successful in the world have we managed to leapfrog and ignore the messy realities of what it takes to make a city successful. It's about the politics, it's about the political economy, it's about figuring out how things work. And yes, it does take time, hopefully not 5 centuries, we don't have that. But it's what makes the city successful and what makes the city sustainable. Because once you figure it out, that's what works in that local space. And those cities that are successful, that have undergone that messy governance, political economy, investment process, are, in fact, the cities that work for all and not just the privileged few. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen.